Hello, everyone. This is Nayiri from Low Carbon Fasting. Now, our guest today is the one and only Dr. Shawn Baker, the author of the Carnivore Diet. And we're going to talk about mainly the carnivore diet. Dr. Baker, you are an orthopedic surgeon, a former orthopedic surgeon. You're also a bodybuilder, athlete, and the co-founder of Revero. We'll talk about that too today in today's podcast. So welcome to Low Carbon Fasting.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. I'm not a bodybuilder, by the way. I lift weights, but I don't.
You lift weights well.
But anyway, this is kind of a minor distinction. But anyway,
we'll definitely talk about lifting weights as well today, which is something I'm interested in. So, as an orthopedic, what was your professional background, Dr. Baker?
Yeah, so I went, I got a biology degree, went to medical school. I took a break to play professional sports for a while, went back into medical school, got my degree, did my training, got into a surgical subspecialty called orthopedic surgery, did that, did my residency for 5 years. Then went back into the military, spent time doing, civilian and then deployed trauma surgery, and then went into private practice for quite some time. And then I ended up sort of transitioning over to this lifestyle nutrition space, which I've been doing for the last several years.
I have been wondering, as an orthopedic surgeon, you've operated on knees and probably hip replacements and those kind of surgeries. So apart from physical injuries, where people would have a fall or accidents and whatever, but apart from those reasons, do you think there was an underlying root cause why people ended up coming for one knee replacement, a couple of years later for the other knee? Do you think there was any underlying cause?
Yes, absolutely. I think that lifestyle plays a huge role in that. In fact, most probably joint replacements are completely avoidable. I used to see over and over again, and I thought it was a good sign because I would take somebody with an arthritic knee, I would replace their knee, they would feel better, and then they would come in a year or two later with their other knee. And I thought it was good because they appreciated what I had done and appreciated, what I had done for them from a surgical standpoint. But at the same point, I should have been more proactive in teaching them about lifestyle so they would have likely or possibly prevented needing the other knee replacement. Yes, I think most orthopedic issues that the general orthopedic sees in his office are probably preventable in their lifestyle related, whether it's arthritis, whether it's tendon problems, tendinopathy, tendinitis, a lot of the nerve compression neuropathies like carpal tunnel syndrome. All those have probably a nutritional component, which when you fix the diet, those things often just get better and go away, which is interesting.
Yeah, I started after I'm type 1 diabetic, and for 44 years now. I believe it's either 44 or 45, I forget. So long term being type 1, I was expected to have to be suffering now from diabetes related complications. But I started eating low carbohydrate sort of diet about 7 years ago. Eventually, I changed it to very strict keto. And after 30 years of being a vegetarian, and this might be something that interests you or fascinates you, 30 years of eating absolutely no meat and no fish, I actually adopted meat, and you have been a great influence on me. It wasn't an easy transition, but I had to do it because low carbohydrate diet alone was good. It was kind of my blood sugars as a type 1 diabetic, but it wasn't enough. I had no musculature and approaching 50, so I couldn't even lift up a kilogram of weight from the ground. I had absolutely no musculature. I probably was insulin resistant, even though I didn't have excess weight. I just generally didn't feel healthy. I felt weak. I had no energy on the low carbohydrate diet, which might surprise people. So I decided I had to introduce meat. I'll tell you what happened because we are going to do some myth busting. Now, as a type 1 diabetic, I have to take insulin for not only the carbohydrates that I eat, but also for the protein, because a proportion of that protein will turn into glucose. The higher the meat content was in my plate, I found that the more insulin I needed. And I was hesitant. That was all new to me. I'd never eaten meat, for most of all of my adult life. So I didn't know how much insulin I needed. But now looking back, my HbA1c actually went up from 5.7% to 6.1%. This isn't the classic story of all diabetics who adopt the carnivore diet. Most diabetics will report, hey, their insulin needs reduced. That's not what happened to me. My actually insulin needs would have increased if I gave myself more insulin to cover the protein, but I just didn't know. I was hesitant. I just couldn't comprehend why I would need that much insulin for the protein. But now, with hindsight, with an HbA1c of 6.1%, which I personally am not happy with because I know I can do better. I could have avoided that if I'd taken more insulin. Any thoughts about the carnivore diet and, specifically for type 1 diabetics?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot. And we've seen certainly a lot of success with type 2 diabetes, people coming off medications, losing weight. Those that are insulin utilizers often reduce or eliminate their insulin. We saw this study out of Harvard where 92% of the type 2 diabetics got off all their insulin, which I think is quite remarkable. With the type 1s, as you know, it is often an autoimmune condition where we have some degree of dysfunction of our beta cells. Whether they're destroyed or they're in quiescence is kind of debatable. I think there's evidence that they probably kind of go silent and they stop losing the capacity to secrete insulin rather than completely dying. And many diabetics, even long-term diabetics, still retain the capacity to secrete a small amount of insulin, and we can see that with C-peptide. And there may be different subtypes. Clearly, there are different subtypes. I think, obviously, the goal is to avoid complications, right? We don't want to have the nephropathy. We don't want the retinopathy. We don't want the cardiovascular disease. And so the question is, what is going to get us there? And some people will say, well, just keep your insulin as low as your glucose as low as possible. And that does seem to help for some people, but I don't know 100% if that is the only thing there. There's other people who would say that, we want to keep your insulin low, and there's certainly a phenomenon called diabulimia, which you're probably familiar with, where people will intentionally not take insulin so they don't gain weight, and basically just their blood sugar goes up and they urinate it all out and they end up not losing weight. And some people do that as a dietary strategy, which also has its problems. And so I think, in your situation, I'm just thinking about where you're at with an increased requirement for insulin. So studies will suggest that the average human pancreas puts out the equivalent of between 30 and 50 IUs of insulin a day. That's kind of average person. Now, the average person, in the United States is probably kind of a sick average person. So maybe that number might be lower. Obviously, it's going to be weight dependent. My pancreas would put out more insulin than yours, I would assume, because I'm a bigger person, right? So I would expect, and clearly, when we look at diabetics, the requirements, they often base it on a per kilo mass because bigger people just need more insulin than smaller people. But you're going from someone with low musculature. So you think about this, I'm putting on more muscle. How do I put on more muscle? Well, I need insulin to do that. Insulin is not, we need some insulin. So I think the thought is that I just want to keep as minimal insulin as possible. And I understand that, one, it's expensive or can be. Two, it's just a thought of I'm taking more and more medication. Am I getting worse? I think you have to put it in the context of what's going on with my body. If I'm putting on muscle and I'm getting stronger and I need 10, 20% more insulin to do that, is that really a bad thing? I don't know that it is. I think, I've seen people go on a carnivore diet where they're like, oh, I'm only taking, 5 units of basal and nothing else. I don't need anything for my meals. And they're celebrating that, but at the same time, maybe they're losing too much weight. Maybe they're losing muscle mass because, insulin has this anabolic effect. It's one of the more powerful anabolic hormones we have. So I don't think we should be completely willing to say I want insulin as low as possible. I think there's some nuance here. Obviously, if you get in a situation where you're using 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 units a day to cover all the carbs, that's probably a problem. But if you're using enough so that you can maintain muscle mass, I don't think it's as big of an issue. And then, whether it's a 6-1 or a, as you probably know, most endocrinologists are thrilled if anybody's in at 6. They're just happy if you're under 7. And so I think their bar is much probably worse than what we'd like to see. If you talk, I'm sure you're familiar with guys like Dr. Richard Bernstein, who advocates 5 or below 5, and he wants an average blood glucose of 83 milligrams per deciliter, which is quite it's quite low. I'm not like I said, I tend to take the approach that these are still all proxy markers, both glucose number, both insulin requirement, and then I tend to say, well, what's actually going on with our physique, with our muscular, with our body composition, and then of course you want to pay attention to those things that you're worried about. What are my eyes doing? Is there any retinopathy there? How's my kidney function? What is going on with my cardiovascular status? And so those things are what we really want to be concerned about. And then I think these other things are, they're kind of, we don't want to be ridiculous on the amount of insulin we use. Obviously we don't want our blood glucose getting up into these really, really high levels. But beyond that, I think there's some nuance here. And so I think we just have to put it in those terms, if that makes sense to you.
Thank you for the fascinating sort of perspective. And for any type 1 diabetic out there wondering, if I'm having just meat or primarily just meat in my plate for the whole day, then my daily intake of insulin, that's just the bolus and basal altogether, the total insulin is around 25 units, 28 units. So I know that I have nothing to worry about, but we're afraid of insulin. We worry about insulin resistance. But I think you're right, it should be taken in context. You have to look at someone's the other health markers as well. One good thing about eating meat-based diets is that the blood sugar variability is marginal. So my blood sugar just stays maybe on the higher range. Maybe I should need more insulin on the higher range of my normal, and my normal just stops at 6. I don't want to go above 6, but it just stays at 6 and it just goes at that level pretty much the whole day. So there is no variability. I'm enjoying it. I'm really loving it. And I'm also enjoying the fact that after introducing meat, I had 2 frozen shoulders, probably glycation. Type 1s are prone to that after eating carbohydrates pretty much my entire adult life. And I was told I should be very careful with exercise. And that was the first time in my life, very close to the age of 50, I actually hit the gym. And no steroid injections, no medication. And I healed my frozen shoulders, on both arms. Now I'm lifting weights. I started lifting weights. I introduced meat. I started lifting weights. Now I'm lifting weights very close to twice my weight. My husband was a former athlete, so he just tells me your transformation is beyond remarkable. Yeah, if I'm able to do all this with 5 more units of insulin, then perhaps I shouldn't worry about it.
Yeah, I think, if you look at the trade-offs there, and good on you for doing the lifting, because I think it's so important for really anybody, to include, and especially females that tend to have always traditionally sort of, I don't want to lift weights because I'm afraid I'm going to get too bulky or too strong. And it's really, really, really difficult to do. And the other caveat of that is if you're taking in more protein, and you correctly point out the fact that you do need to dose for protein. A lot of people say it's about a half for what you might have for carbohydrates, but it varies. And as you know, your sensitivity throughout the day, having been the 44 years in this, you probably know that maybe later in the day you may be more insulin sensitive, or maybe, it depends. And then of course, exercise has a role here. And so we know that, if your blood sugar is high, you can always go for a little walk, and some gentle exercise usually brings it down pretty consistently. Whereas intense exercise can maybe temporarily raise it up. And so I think you have to figure out how that plays, and you might have to dose insulin for that in some cases, and so it's one of those things where, if you can use insulin as, I wouldn't treat it always as a bad thing. You use it as, not only to correct blood sugar, but also to build muscle. This is what it does. I mean, but you don't want to get to the point where you're storing excess body fat. So this is where you have to, You have to be very smart, I think, as a type 1 diabetic, and you have to really learn and understand the nuance of the physiology and see how exercise and sleep and what type of exercise and the timing of exercise. And you're correct, how much you're eating and what the size of the meals are. We know that, for instance, there's studies out there looking at protein consumption, and it takes about 75 grams of protein by itself to cause a blood glucose increase for a normal person. Now, a diabetic might have a different response to that, but when you're eating it with fat, there's going to be a delay in the blood glucose rise, and so you might have to dose your mealtime dose. Maybe have to be broken into two, an early and a late dose to sort of cover that rise. So it's interesting stuff, interesting physiology for sure.
Yes, I have a pump, and yeah, I can relate to that. So if I have cheese with my steak, for example, then I can have that delayed effect, even sometimes up to eight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 8 hours.
hours.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, absolutely.
But I do have a pump, and so it's relatively easy to sort of manage the ups and downs. Dr. Baker, shall we do some myth busting for anyone who's a bit hesitant of the benefits or the health benefits of the carnivore diet? The carnivore diet, I mean, you're not very rigid in its description. I mean, you do say that if someone wants to have a piece of cheese every now and again, I mean, you yourself have a piece of cheese every now and again, that's fine. And so it doesn't have to be completely rigid. You have to eat red meat every single day, sort of thing, or is it?
No, it's if you read my book, I mentioned that there's certainly room for variability, and I think people just, I mean, it's not sort of the opposite of what like veganism, where there's a strict ideology attached to it. This is basically just we're using animal foods to get us healthier, appreciating how nutritious they actually are, and how well our physiology tends to do with them, and then you kind of just use what you need, and if you like, for instance, my diet right now is pretty much red meat and eggs, steak and eggs. Sometimes I don't have the eggs, and sometimes I'll add some dairy in there. And every once in a while, I have something that's has some plant, based food in there. But that's extremely, extremely rare for me. And so, yeah, I tend not to say never or always or be very rigid on this stuff. And it's a lot of it, you have to. I mean, if you just understand that meat is a health food, and likely the more of it you eat, the better you're going to be in many cases. And then you just kind of put that in context, and I think that really helps to get you where. Now, there's some people, for whatever reason, maybe they have some strong food addiction issues, maybe they have some really, really severe autoimmune or gut issues where they have to be very strict for an extended period of time. And some people like it, and they just like it's the simplicity of it. It's not hard. It doesn't take a lot of planning and timing and calculation outside of maybe perhaps being a type 1 diabetic, but. Yeah, I mean, I've been intentionally not strict about this or very dogmatic about it, because I think there's a lot of nuance, and there's a lot of stuff we don't know yet. So I think that's how we should approach it.
So what would you say to people who worry that, okay, so meat or excess meat will damage their kidneys? I know, and I've had many other guests who've told me specifically what damages the human kidneys most of the time, but it definitely is not meat, or is it?
Well, I mean, there's no evidence that would suggest, well, I shouldn't say, there's no scientific or experimental evidence that would suggest that meat damages kidneys. In fact, we're seeing quite the opposite happen. I mean, I know people on a carnivore diet, and again, this is all anecdotal, so I'll put that caveat there, that are seeing reversal of chronic kidney disease going on a carnivore diet. They actually improve it. And there's studies out there suggesting that high quality protein substituted for refined carbohydrates and other processed food ends up causing a reversal of kidney damage. The study, the meta-analysis Stu Phillips did in 2018, looking at higher protein versus lower protein, showed no negative effect on kidneys, because the concern is always about protein typically. We do know that kidneys will spill protein when they're damaged, but it's not the protein that's causing the damage in pretty much almost all cases. Most of the time, the most common reason for dialysis is diabetes. I mean, this is clear. And so controlling your blood glucose, getting off that crazy high blood sugars that you often see on a carbohydrate-based diet, where, your blood glucose might shoot up, to 12 or 14, and your units are 300 plus in the U.S. units. can often happen. And so avoiding those things are going to be what improves the kidney health.
How about the link between red meat and what cancer? That's another one that people are terrified about.
Well, I think for good reason. I mean, I think cancer is something we want to avoid. I mean, and the one that, red meat has most closely been linked to colorectal cancer on some epidemiologic studies. In fact, the World Health Organization in 2015 declared unprocessed red meat a type 2 carcinogen. Now, what behind that story is that the relative risk or the absolute risk of red meat and cancer increases your absolute risk by about 1%. So it's a very small amount. Okay. So 1% in those that eat red meat versus those that don't eat meat based on the World Health Organization data. Now, people that were on that committee, like, I'm blanking on his name right. I'll think David Clearfield. Professor David Clearfield was on that committee, and he basically said that they literally ignored all the data that said red meat does not cause cancer. They threw out all the studies. They didn't consider those. About 30% of the participants on that trial were vegan or vegetarian, so they had a sort of an ethical a bias there, which they failed to declare. Now, there have been a number of subsequent studies, since 2015. There was a huge study in 2019, the largest review ever done on red meat, and several papers came out of that, all suggesting that there is little to no evidence whatsoever that shows that red meat is a carcinogen. But when we look at our risk for cancer, if we say red meat causes a 1% absolute risk, so if you had a 4% chance of developing colon cancer, now you have a 5%, so 1% risk, which is about a 17% relative risk increase. Let's compare it to other things that are associated with cancer. Obesity carries something like 150% increase risk, some maybe as high as 300%, particularly if it's central obesity. Now we're talking 400% risk. Diabetes increases your risk by cancer for maybe 200%. When we're looking at chronic inflammation, we see another 150, 200% increase. Things particularly, which carnivore diet seem to help extremely well with, are things like inflammatory bowel disease, ulcerative colitis, and Crohn's disease. That increases your risk for cancer about 3,000%. So when we put all these things together and say you on a carnivore diet, you lose weight, your obesity gets better, your central obesity gets better, your blood glucose improves, your inflammation improves, which all pretty reliably happen, your risk for cancer actually has gone down significantly, much more significantly, and it way overshadows the small 1% absolute risk that the World Health Organization posited, even though many other organizations now disagree with that. So I don't think it is a factor. I think the biggest factor for colorectal cancer, again, is the modern standard diet, which is just complete, garbage, ultra-processed food everywhere. 60% of the U.S. diet is ultra-processed food, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure where are you calling from, by the way?
Well, I'm calling from Mexico at the moment, but I'm from the UK, and I was just about to say it's very similar in the UK. Very similar.
Yeah, right. It's very similar in the UK, and so, I think if we focus on those things and the bigger picture risk factors, the same thing with cardiovascular disease, we can make the same argument there. We can see that, the average American, for instance, eats about 2 ounces of red meat a day, or 2 ounces of beef, I should be more specific. That's a tiny, tiny amount. And 60% of our calories are coming from ultra-processed food. And just from a common sense standpoint, you would say the stuff that we're eating the most of, which we hadn't eaten. Beef consumption in the United States has gone down tremendously. It used to be almost close to twice that 50 years ago. We used to eat twice as much red meat. Now we're eating close to half that. And diabetes, obesity, chronic inflammation, autoimmune diseases, mental health disease, all have gone up significantly since that time. It's not, you can't, infer directly, but it makes it hard to make the case that red meat is responsible for this when we've been eating less of it and these conditions are getting more prevalent.
Or exercise, Dr. Baker, exercise. I know that gym subscriptions, for example, or gym memberships in the US at least have gone up in the last couple of decades. Diabetes rates have also gone up. So it's, type 2 diabetes isn't because you failing to go to the gym. It's not happening because you're not exercising enough. It's mainly the diet.
Yeah, you know, we all hear this. You can't outrun a bad diet. I think exercise is incredibly important. I think it's wonderful. It has tremendous benefits. I think we should all be doing it, to include strength training. However, it's not going to be a substitute for continuing to eat a bad diet. I mean, there's a point. Some people can do it for a short period of time, but and I did. I mean, honestly, it caught up with me in my early 40s. I'm 55 now, and when I was about 42, I remember I'm like, okay, what I'm doing is not working from a dietary standpoint. And I was training extremely hard. I mean, I was still competing at a world class level, training like a world champion athlete that I was, and I was still developing, you know, metabolic disease. So you cannot, over the long term, outrun a bad diet.
How about fiber?
Yep.
Fiber is necessary to feed the gut bacteria.
Well, I mean, this is obviously a huge topic. First of all, fiber is not an essential nutrient. It just clearly isn't. I mean, I would have long died if it had been. So it's not essential. And there are numerous historical populations that subsisted on very low or no fiber diets. You know, you can look at the, you know, the circumpolar populations throughout, you know, whether it's Alaska, Canada, Scandinavia, and Russia. You can look at some of these Nilotic African populations, the Mongolians, and they just didn't have much fiber in their diet, if any. And they did not have nutrient deficiencies. They didn't die. There are people that don't even have a colon, right? They've had their colon excised and they live long, healthy, normal lifespans. You know, they don't necessarily die early in many cases. I think the belief that fiber is beneficial, and it can be. I mean, I think fiber can be very beneficial in the context of if you're eating the standard American diet, the standard Mexican diet, and you know, if you include more fruits and vegetables and whole grains relative to what else you might be eating, which is, you know, maybe the pure junk food, then it's going to provide a benefit. We also know that people that do those things, you know, that eat more fruits and vegetables tend to be wealthier. It's just, and there's the socioeconomic effect that goes on that. There's a healthy user bias. All those things clearly have a role there. I think, you know, when we talk about the mechanisms by which fiber may be beneficial, it can mitigate a blood sugar spike, right? So if you eat an apple or you drink apple juice, same amount of calories, the apple juice is going to shoot your blood glucose very high, where the apple you're going to get a more sort of a slower effect, and so that can be beneficial. But when you're eating a meat-based diet, again, you don't really have those big, huge blood sugar excursions. So does it even matter in that situation? The other thought is that fiber is going to provide satiety and therefore contribute to weight loss, and it can. You know, if you fill your stomach up with lots of leaves and stuff, maybe you feel full, maybe you feel bloated and uncomfortable, but but it produces a satiety effect. Now, I would argue in many cases, a meat-based diet provides that same level of satiety, and sometimes better for some people, not everybody, but for some. And so they just don't get hungry between meals. You know, you can go 6 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours, 14, 16, 18, sometimes 24 hours between meals. You're not dealing with hunger. So there's you know, maybe that satiety effect is not as important for people on maybe a meat-based or a carnivore diet. And then I think the final thing that people talk about as far as mechanisms is that fiber, there are bacteria in our gut that can utilize fiber to ferment that and produce these short chain fatty acids, things like butyrate, which tends to, at least we believe it tends to benefit the mucosal layer of the colon or the colonic cells. That butyrate can be obtained other ways. You know, you can get it from having ketones in our body. So ketones, the most common ketone body that we see in the blood, or the main one, is beta hydroxybutyrate, which sounds very much like butyrate. And the only difference is a simple hydroxyl molecule, an OH molecule, oxygen, hydrogen. Those are easily interchanged. They can go back and forth. And some people think that the reason butyrate from the colon, from fiber, is helpful because it later converts to beta hydroxybutyrate, which may in fact help the cells out. So those cells are well vascularized. You've got blood flow going to the colonic cells, are getting butyrate one way, either from the colon, from the gut lining, or from within through the blood supply. Also, we know that other short chain fatty acids, protein can you know, turn into propionate, acetate, methylbutyrate, all these types of things. So I think the benefits are, again, relative. Again, if you are on a standard high carb, maybe junk food diet, and probably eating more fiber in your diet, is going to show a benefit. You know, most of the comparison studies, the epidemiologic studies, again, are almost always, what is your comparator group? Well, the low fiber group almost always has a poor quality diet. You know, You know, they've done polyp prevention trials where they added fiber supplements. It made no difference whatsoever in colonic polyps. There's you know, a study looking at colonoscopies where people ate lots of fiber versus people eat low fiber, and the people that ate lots of fiber had higher disease rates. They had higher rates of diverticulosis, and so I think, again, I think it is a of relative benefit depending on who you are. It's not essential. Clearly, it's not, and I'm not concerned about it. In fact, these populations, these Inuit populations, when they looked at their gut diversity, they had very diverse guts. I mean, they still had plenty of, you know, microbial diversity. They didn't have problems. And again, at the end of the day, what do we want to measure? We want to measure actual disease, not these proxy markers. You know, I think, again, I think the concern around the microbiome, yes, it has an impact. Yes, it's important. Do we even know 1% of what's going on? Probably not. So we're still in the infancy. And so to sort of say this diet is better because it produces this subset of bacteria, you can't extrapolate that to the whole population. I think we're too far away from being able to do that, and we probably never will get there, quite honestly.
And talking of some of those meat-eating indigenous populations, they're not suffering constipation either. They're not suffering from diabetes or cancer either. So, okay. So how would someone start on the carnivore diet? I was coaching one type 2 diabetic. He'd just recently been diagnosed, and I was explaining what foods contain carbohydrates, etc., etc. So he asked me, he said, so what can I eat to minimize my carbohydrates? I said, well, just meat, fish. I called it the zero carb diet. And then after you talk about the carnivore diet, now I call it the carnivore diet. Did you come up with the word, by the way?
Yes, yeah, it was interesting when you know, I started this. So I've been doing it for about 6 years now, and before, about 7 years ago, I came across a group calling it a zero carb diet, zeroing in on health. Charles Washington and others who were using that term, and I was very interested in what they were doing. I thought they were kind of crazy at first, and then I kind of just followed along, and you know, I eventually would convince myself to try it, and then I just thought the name was too confusing when you say zero carb, because people are like, well, can I have, you know, can I drink, you know, canola oil and soybean oil, and can I have, you know, all this sort of diet Coke, and that really wasn't within the context of what we're trying to get across. It was people are eating meat, and that was the main thing. So I did come up with the term carnivore diet. I'm not the first doctor to advocate all meat diets. There's been plenty of physicians throughout history. You know, Rollo, a Scottish surgeon from the late 1700s, was advocating all meat diets for diabetics. So this has been known for literally centuries, if not longer. And but I did come up with the term carnivore diet. I wrote the book. You know, I've got, you know, I think I've got it here. Actually, I've got it here. It is. There's no, you know, carnivore diet. That's my book that I wrote. That I came up, and you know, when I wrote the book, I didn't plan on writing a book. The publisher actually approached me and said, "Hey, would you please write a book about this stuff?" And I said, "Okay, yeah." And I named it the Carnivore Diet at the time. And that name has, for whatever reason, sort of stuck, and it's becoming quite popular right now. So,
so I was, you know, asking you about how someone might start. As I said,
yeah,
one of my clients just decided, once he knew
yeah.
that he could minimize his carbs by just eating meat and fish, he did it from one day to another. Do you find that he just had? I have no difficulty. I love meat, and he lost weight. He reversed his diabetes. He's still a carnivore. He's still eating primarily meat. But so for a beginner, for someone who's a bit hesitant, what would be a good way to transition into a meat-based diet?
Sure. Well, I'll tell you what, you know, and I think, you know, I think there's a couple point occasions. If you're a diabetic, if you're on a lot of blood pressure medications, you just have to realize that those medications you're going to probably need to taper off, and you're going to probably want to do that with the assistance of your healthcare provider, because you can get into trouble if you have really low blood glucose or low blood pressure, and that sometimes will happen. So you just be mindful of that. I think you can transition. I started out, I mean, I literally just did one meal. I did a carnivore meal. It was like steak and eggs. I was like, well, this tastes pretty good. I like it. And then I did that, you know, I do that a couple days a week. And then I said, well, let's just do a whole day. Let's do a whole day of carnivore, you know. And it was fine. I mean, you just get used to not having the starch or the vegetables or the fruit or whatever on the plate, and just kind of get used to that pattern. And some people, you might methodically say, okay, I'm going to reduce carbohydrate content by 25% each week over a period of 4 weeks. The same thing with the fiber, to give myself a bit more of a gentle transition. And I think that works fine. There's some people where they don't do well with moderation. They have to abstain. And it's just like they've got to go full speed in and just like, okay, tomorrow I'm eating nothing but meat. And that can work too. You just have to be mindful that the transition may be a little more aggressive, and you might have more symptoms of that. And so I think people that have a lot of medical issues may make more sense to transition more slowly. So yeah, I mean, I did a meal, then a day, then a couple of days, then I did a whole week, then I did 2 weeks. And then I think, somewhere in 2016, I did a full month. And then I was kind of hooked. I was like, wow, I just feel really, really amazingly good. And so I went back to a regular diet for really just 24 hours, and I immediately felt worse. And I made a decision that, hey, I look to feel better. And so I made a decision, and I kept going. I was going to go as long as I could. I said, maybe I'll make it 6 months, and 6 months turned into a year, and a year turned into 2 years. And now here I am 6 years later, still doing the same thing and still doing well.
So meat and LDL cholesterol. I mean, that's a topic that interests me as well. Obviously, after 30 years of not eating meat, when I first started, it was literally, I had to be chopped down because I couldn't literally, I wasn't familiar with the whole sort of process of chewing, and that was very, very difficult for me mentally. I couldn't chew. It was not something I remembered from my childhood. So I transitioned very, very slowly, but I would literally like hide the meat in my fork with big chunks of cheese. Cheese was one. I love cheese, and cheese isn't a free food, by the way, for diabetics or anyone wondering. You do need a lot of insulin for cheese as well. But yeah, I was literally hiding everything in cheese. So 6 months later, I found my LDL had gone up. Now, I will never find out. I will never know if it was the meat, which I just recently started introducing, or the excess cheese. I know it was excess. But I think my next one, 6 months down the line, now that I'm not eating as much cheese, it would be interesting to see if LDL has gone down with less cheese. And then maybe I'll be able to kind of have a clearer understanding whether it was the meat or the cheese, the saturated fats. What were your thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, first of all, and it could be other things too. I mean, it's not just, there are other things that affect LDL outside of just diets. But I think LDL cholesterol is a very crude marker. There's so much more nuance to what we should be looking at with regards to, I mean, and the reason we're checking this is because we're concerned about potential heart disease and other things. And we know that in many populations, low LDL cholesterol is associated with worse outcomes with regard to mortality, all-cause mortality, whether it's cancer, dementia, infectious disease, even heart disease. There are a number of studies that show that having too low LDL cholesterol is a problem. Some people will say that's a reverse causality thing. It's only because you get sick and your LDL falls, although that's unclear. I think, when we're talking about that, I mean, there's more nuance to this. For instance, if you have low triglycerides and relatively higher HDL in that situation, we almost always are going to find what's called a pattern A lipoprotein particle size. And so we have big particles, which tend to be less atherogenic. There are some other studies out there that would suggest that, well, for instance, we kind of talked about this during the cancer segment of this. What are the risk factors for heart disease? And you're the perfect person for this. There was a Women's Health Initiative assessment done in 2021 where they looked at risk factors for heart disease. Number one was diabetes, 10x risk for diabetes. After that, it was, I believe, obesity was up there. Metabolic syndrome was a 6-fold risk. Obesity was a 4-fold risk. I think smoking was a 3-fold risk. Family history is a 1.5 to 2-fold risk. LDL cholesterol is only about a 1.3 fold risk, and so it's a really relatively minor risk factor in this. Triglycerides were higher; it was like 2.2 or something like that. So I think that we have to just put it in context, understand its value, what the overall picture is. You can always assess your, get more information about your vascular health, the coronary artery calcium scan, which is a CAT scan of your heart, which tells you how much calcification in there. I had mine done, after several years being a carnivore, and it was a zero, which many people seem to notice the same thing. So I think whether or not the diet raises LDL, and according to the Harvard University study, I think about 20% of the people saw an increase in LDL cholesterol, which is considered dyslipidemia by conventional measures. However, if we have all these other factors that are improving, is your risk going up or down? Probably your risk is going down. So that's how I tend to look at things in kind of the big picture.
I have to say though, but my triglycerides were very low. HDL was high. So
Yep.
it was a healthy balance overall, except the fact that LDL was high. At what point do you need to stop eating more protein, for example? So is one piece of ribeye steak enough? Or if you're still hungry, should you go for another? Knowing that that's probably excess, so to speak. Well, not necessarily excess in protein terms, but it's some of it at least is going to turn into glucose. Any comments on that?
Yeah, and again, this is kind of another very nuanced topic. So I think the blood sugar rise you might see after a protein meal, I think gluconeogenesis is always occurring, and you're never going to stop it from occurring. When you sleep, it's occurring. So it's part of our natural physiology. It's always there. It's there for a reason. In fact, some people will make the claim that gluconeogenesis provides the amount of glucose that's needed, or at least for a normal person. There is, whenever you say what's too much, well, too much automatically means it's bad. So you don't. It more is like, well, how do we define what's too much? I think that again, what I was pointing to, that when we eat some protein, I think what happens is you get a stimulation of glucagon, and as you probably know, glucagon causes the liver to release glucose, glycogenolysis. So it's a kind of regulatory hormone, just like norepinephrine and cortisol do. So you stimulate this glucagon response via protein, and I think that's probably what's driving the early rise in blood glucose, not necessarily gluconeogenesis.
Right.
I think that tends to be more of a slower process because you first have to fully break down the protein. That usually meat is sitting in your stomach for 3 or 4 hours before it's released, and then it gets into the small intestine, and it has to be broke down into its composite amino acids, the peptides and the amino acids, and then the carbon skeleton has to be stripped off, and then the nitrogen forms, and then some of those carbon skeletons go to ketones, some of them go to glucose production. But much of the protein goes directly into structural requirements, and so we get more efficient at gluconeogenesis as we limit carbohydrates over time. We know that's true. So we more effectively restore our glycogen reserves. So most people will line up appetite. You think about how human or animal physiology is designed. Most animals in the wild don't have diabetes, they don't have obesity issues, they tend not to have chronic disease for the most part. I mean, they will die of trauma or injury or infection, things like that, or malnutrition or starvation, but generally if they're eating their native diet. So I think a native natural diet for human beings is very much meat-based based on our evolutionary history. And so I think that there's a balance between satiety, the amount of satiety meat produces, and what's going on physiologically. So it's not impossible to overeat anything, really. I mean, meat included. It becomes more difficult. And so I'd say, well, how do you know if you're overeating meat? Well, if you're starting to accumulate excess body fat, for sure. If you're seeing really sort of, high blood glucose, as a type 1 diabetic, again, that's a special situation there. You might see that maybe you're eating. It could be that you're having this overly robust glucagon response, and so you might have to. Maybe you can still eat the same amount of meat, but you might have to break it into smaller dosages. So there's different ways to do that. I don't think anybody truly knows, but I think things that I would be concerned about is: am I gaining excess body fat? Am I seeing abnormally high blood glucose spikes? And then the other thing would be, given if you're eating the same amount of food every day, are you requiring more and more and more insulin? Because then you would be becoming more insulin resistant, right? That's the definition of that. So if you're eating, a certain amount of meat and your blood glucose sort of stays the same and your insulin requirements are pretty much staying the same, you're probably fine, most likely, in that situation.
Yeah, Dr. Bernstein also talks about sort of smaller portions,
Hmm.
sort of three
Yeah, he
meals,
like
divided
yeah,
into 3 meals, then having one large portion. I notice that when I have one meal, and I do occasionally have just one meal because I don't feel hungry the rest of the time. My blood sugar is going so beautifully, a straight line. I just don't want to change anything. I don't want to eat because I'm not feeling hungry, because I don't want to disrupt my beautiful line.
right.
But I know it's not ideal for me because I'm probably not getting enough nutrient from that one meal. So I don't want to do that consistently. And to get enough nutrients, I literally would have to overindulge
One meal, right? Yeah.
one meal, and that would shoot my blood glucose right up, even if the meal doesn't contain any carbs.
Right.
And by
Sure.
carbs, I mean, I'm on ketogenic diet. So I'm no vegetables, no spinach, no whatever in there. So I'm avoiding now. I'm just experimenting and avoiding the one meal because of what you
One
just.
one meal a day is tough. I mean, for many people to get, like you pointed out, it's tough to get all your food in, and you might not enjoy it. You know, like I said, I can do the same thing, but then I have to eat 4 pounds of meat in one sitting, which is it's not enjoy. I mean, the first 2 pounds are okay, but the next two are not so fun. And so I like to eat 2 meals a day. That works well for me. But yeah, I think that if you can occasionally do one meal a day is probably fine. But like I said, you want to. I think I would be concerned about how much muscle am I retaining, am I getting stronger, and that's a really good metric, I think, for measuring overall health.
I agree. Let's finish this up with a vegan diet. You criticize the vegan diet, and not necessarily the people who sort of eat the vegan diet, but but people who want to promote it as a nutritionally complete diet and is as the ideal diet for the whole world. And
Right.
we know that's not true. And that does irritate me personally as well, even though I have been a vegetarian for 30 years. I didn't raise my child as a vegetarian. I cooked meat for my whole family. It was just it was my choice. I didn't want to eat the meat, but that was it for me. I never preached anyone to become a vegan or a vegetarian. But it does irritate me when people say, oh, you must eat, everyone needs to eat vegan to be healthy, or it's the ideal diet for everyone.
Yeah, and to be fair, I mean, I do push back fairly aggressively on this, and the reason is not because I think any particular vegan person is, all vegans are bad people. Most of them are very lovely, nice people. I know many of them that are great people, but there is a particular subset that are particularly aggressive, very sort of, they want to control what everyone eats. They want to label you as a animal abuser or a murderer or a rapist, or you hear it on and on and on, and to claim that their diet is the only way to be healthy and it's the healthiest diet there. The data just doesn't support that, and I think the reality, more importantly, doesn't support that. I mean, there are so many people that went on a vegan diet have ruined their health and have restored it by including meat back in that, and some of them going full carnivore. So yeah, I think it's necessary to push back against that, and sometimes you have to do it in ways that are a bit more over the top, I suppose. I try to use some humor in some of the stuff, and yes, but I think we are being sort of pushed towards this. Everybody needs to be on a plant-based diet to save the planet, again, which I think is also misguided. And so I think we all need to push back against this, because I mean, how valuable is your own health to you? If you didn't have the option to eat like you do and you were forced to eat a high-carb plant-based diet, you would be suffering, and it's not fair for humans, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, I did suffer. I ate a very clean diet. I have to say, I even baked bread every single morning at home because I wouldn't buy the shop bought ones. But the fact that my diet was high in carbohydrates started having an effect on me with glycation and beginning of arthritis, which I still haven't fully recovered from, but I'm hoping that the longer I stick to, to meat, the better or the healthier I will get. Dr. Baker, I know we've run out of time. I can't thank you enough for your time today. There is so much more I would have asked you if we had more time. So perhaps we need to do this again.
Yeah, yeah. Let's set up a version 2 down the road a little bit. Yeah, I do unfortunately have to go do. I've got 2 more of these to do right at back to back. So thank you so much for having me. I appreciate, and it's good to see. The type one diabetic need to understand this stuff, and I think it's
Thank you so much for your time, and I'll keep in touch. And if I can be of any
That,
help,
to
let
some
me
degree,
know.
if you don't have to be strict in many cases, some people do.
Thank you so much. You have a good day and keep doing what you're doing.